Hello there, and welcome to Echoes of the Forgotten Earth, where curiosity settles in close, and science takes the long way around, quiet, scenic, and gentle enough to follow you towards sleep. Tonight, we're going to drift into one of the most devastating pivots our planet has ever endured. A moment so immense that, if you had lived through it, you wouldn't have called it dramatic. You would have called it final. The kind of ending no creature has words for. The kind of ending that rewrites what tomorrow even means. I'm talking about the day a visitor from space, an ancient rock wider than any city, heavy as history, came tearing down through the sky and changed everything that had ever lived. For more than 150 million years, dinosaurs were not just the headline, they were the entire program. They filled the lead roles in the quiet corners. They moved like weather across continents. They shaped forests by appetite alone. They turned shorelines into hunting grounds. They made the world feel, if you could feel it from within, permanent. And then, in a single collision, permanence cracked. You and I are here because of that accident. That wrong place, wrong time. That cosmic misstep. Tonight we're going to walk slowly through what the earth became afterward, what the air tasted like, what the light looked like when the sun was still there but couldn't reach you, what survived, what didn't, and how the world, almost unrecognizable, began assembling something familiar from the wreckage. But before we step into that deep memory, let me ask you something small, just between us. Where are you listening from right now? Is it morning? Light pushing through your curtains while the world starts moving again? Or is it night, the room dim, the sky outside dark, your thoughts finally loosening their grip? Wherever you are, pause for a second and picture a planet that didn't know what was coming. A warm day, a living forest, rivers sliding through green, creatures moving with ordinary purpose. Eat, drink, nest, hunt, without the slightest hint that the clock was about to reset. Strange, isn't it? That something that happened 66 million years ago can still send echoes into this quiet moment we're sharing. And if this kind of slow exploration, science braided with story, feels calming or intriguing or simply like a soft place to rest your mind, I'd be grateful if you tapped, like, or subscribed. It helps this little corner of quiet reach others who might be awake for no good reason, searching for something steady to listen to. Maybe someone else out there will find their breathing slow down with us and drift. Now, let's begin like we're stepping into a vast museum after hours. The lights are low, the air is still, and the exhibits aren't bones behind glass. They're living scenes, unfolding around us. Somewhere, in the darkness of space, 66 million years ago, a rock fell toward Earth. It struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico with a force that defies ordinary comparison. Billions of atomic bombs worth of energy released in an instant. It carved a wound in the crust more than 100 miles across and deeper than anything you'd want to stand near. The impact unleashed heat so violent the air itself became flame. That moment is where we're stepping in, but we won't linger on the flash for long. Tonight isn't only about the blast. The blast is the opening note. What haunts me, what fascinates me, is everything after. The quiet hours, the stunned days, the long, patient months when the planet had to reckon with what had happened. In those first hours, dust and vaporized rock were hurled high into the atmosphere. Molten droplets, tiny beads of liquefied earth, rose and spread like a halo. Imagine the sky lit not by stars, but by countless burning fragments returning home. Re-entering the air, they glowed white-hot and rained down across continents. Forests caught fire in distant places that never heard the impact itself. Animals ran, not knowing what they ran from, only that the world had turned wrong. Along coastlines, the ocean heaved. Great waves spread outward from the strike zone. Walls of water that carried the sea inland and then pulled it back out again, dragging life with it. And then, after the screaming violence, came a kind of stillness. Imagine waking, if you were alive, if you were lucky, into a world where the sun did not rise the way it used to, where the air smelled of sulfur and ash, where the day was dimmer than twilight, where sound didn't travel the same because there weren't enough living bodies left to make noise. That silence is where our story rests tonight, because the Earth after impact was not instantly dead. It was altered, shocked, stripped of certainty. High in the stratosphere, dust spread and wrapped the globe in a thin, brutal veil. Sunlight couldn't pierce it easily. Temperatures began to fall, and photosynthesis, the quiet miracle plants used to turn light into living tissue, stalled almost everywhere. In a world that runs on green, that is a kind of starvation at the root. The dinosaurs that survived the initial blast found themselves in a place where the pantry was emptying day by day. Leaf eaters starved first. Then the predators that depended on them followed, step by step, like dominoes falling in slow motion. Insects scurried through ash. Some vanished. Some thrived, feeding on the sudden abundance of dead wood and bodies. Small mammals, easy to overlook, easy to underestimate, pressed deeper into burrows, living off seeds and roots and whatever else they could find in the dark. It's tempting to imagine the end is quick, like a door slamming. But it wasn't. For weeks, months, perhaps years, Earth remained in this dimness. Fires burned themselves out and their smoke joined the dust aloft. Acid rain fell, turning rivers and lakes harsh and unfamiliar. The oceans cooled. The edges of ecosystems unraveled. If you had stood on that planet and opened your eyes, the first thing you would have noticed is the light, or what passed for it. Not black, not fully, but a low gray, like standing under storm clouds that never moved. The second thing would be the air. Thick, gritty, hard to breathe. Each inhale carrying tiny reminders of catastrophe. The third would be sound, or its absence. Forests gone quiet. Fewer calls, fewer wing beats, fewer footsteps. Silence stretching for miles, broken only by wind moving over ash and the occasional crack of a dying tree. If you survived, you would have felt like you were standing in the ruins of a world that was not coming back. And yet, deep below the soil, seeds waited. In dark water, small fish still moved. In sheltered pockets, life held on, fragile, stubborn, unromantic in its insistence. Scientists call this stretch of time the aftermath of the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event. It's a clean phrase, clinical and tidy, but it doesn't capture the scale. More than 70% of all species vanished, entire families erased. The dinosaurs, except for one narrow lineage that would become modern birds, were gone. The great flying pterosaurs disappeared. The ammonites that filled the seas vanished. Marine reptiles that once ruled coastal waters were erased like chalk from a board. And here, in the strange, quiet spaces, mammals began to stir. Not heroic mammals, not yet. Small, furry, adaptable mammals that had lived in the margins of the dinosaur world, scurrying, hiding, existing between the feet of giants. But after the asteroid, those margins became center stage. With the giants gone, there was space. Space to eat, space to grow, space to try new shapes, space for a different kind of life to become loud. And that is why we walk this story tonight. Not only because the asteroid ended the age of dinosaurs, but because it built the world that would eventually welcome us. It forced Earth into a reset, harsh and unforgiving, yes, but also strangely creative. From the ash of forests came new kinds of plants. From the burrows of mammals came diversity. From oceans scraped clean of their old rulers came new waves of evolution. The Earth after impact was not only a graveyard, it was a workshop. Silent at first, then whispering, then slowly finding its voice again. So settle in as we continue. We won't rush. Earth didn't rush either. It took millions of years to rebuild ecosystems, stabilize climate, repopulate forests and seas. Every step holds stories, tragic, surprising, quietly miraculous. And as we trace them, we won't only see what happened long ago. We'll feel what it suggests about our present, our fragility, our resilience. The way one event can tilt the future into a shape no one alive at the time could predict. Because Earth has been broken before, scarred, left for dead, and it healed. It adapted. It flourished again. That is the deep, steady rhythm of this planet. And it begins for us tonight, in the long shadow of a falling star. It begins quietly. 66 million years ago, Earth spun through an ordinary day. Continents sat in different positions than today, but oceans still rolled, forests still whispered, and the skies were busy with wings. Dinosaurs crossed plains, waded through rivers, nested among trees. Some were towering shapes that shook the ground with each step. Others were quick-footed and small, darting through ferns. Early birds, already descended from dinosaur ancestors, glided overhead, calling to one another in voices that might sound oddly familiar if you listen from the right distance. Crocodiles slipped into rivers. Turtles warmed themselves along banks. Insects droned in the heat. To the creatures living then, it was just another morning. Eating, hunting, resting, raising young. Nothing on Earth gave the slightest hint this ordinary stretch of time would be the last of its kind. But above them, far beyond their sight, a rock was falling. Not a pebble, not a boulder. A mountain moving fast enough to make speed meaningless. This asteroid had orbited the sun for millions of years, nudged little by the gravity wells of planets until its path intersected perfectly, terribly, with Earth. It measured about 10 kilometers across, and it traveled faster than 20 kilometers per second. In the time it takes you to blink, it crossed the length of multiple football fields. There was no warning, no instinct for it. The sky looked the way it always had, wide, bright, painted with clouds. And then, the impact. In what is now the Yucatan, the asteroid struck shallow water. In one instant, reefs and fish and everything living there was erased. The energy released was greater than billions of nuclear bombs combined. The rock punched a crater more than 100 miles wide. The ground heaved. Shock waves ran outward. Water was thrown into the sky higher than any mountain. If you could have watched from space, the sight would have been mesmerizing and horrifying. A flash brighter than the sun's surface blooming across the planet. A fireball expanding. Rings of debris arcing outward. From orbit, Earth would have looked wounded. For creatures on the surface, there was no time to understand. Anything within hundreds of miles was obliterated, vaporized by heat and pressure. Forests turned to flame. Rivers boiled away. Animals caught in the open stood no chance. It was as if a whole region had been dropped into the heart of a volcano. The shock waves didn't stay near the crater. They raced through the crust, triggering earthquakes stronger than anything in human experience. Mountains shook, valleys cracked, landslides thundered down slopes. In oceans far from the impact, tsunamis rose, walls of water surging toward distant shores. And above all of it, the sky began to rain fire. Molten fragments thrown into space fell back through the atmosphere, glowing white-hot, turning the air into an oven. Forests thousands of miles away burst into flames as the rain of fire swept across them. Smoke choked the air. Flames leapt from treetop to treetop. Whole landscapes burned at once. Some scientists believe nearly every forest on Earth caught fire in those hours, leaving behind a planet smothered in ash. The heat alone killed. The atmosphere, superheated by returning debris, baked the surface for hours. Only those sheltered underground, underwater, or deep in burrows had a chance. Even then, survival was not guaranteed. And yet, not everything perished immediately. Crocodiles in rivers, shielded by water, endured. Mammals pressed deeper into soil, seeds stayed sealed in the ground. Insects that could feed on decay found abundance. But for the towering dinosaurs, the ones that had ruled so long, this was the beginning of their end. After the first hours, after the brightest violence had passed, the real cruelty began to unfold in slower motion, because the asteroid didn't need to kill every dinosaur with heat and pressure. It only needed to break the systems that kept them alive. It only needed to cut the power to the living world. And it did. The sky darkened, not the normal dark of a storm that clears by morning, but a spreading dimness, an illness in the light itself. Dust, soot, pulverized rock, and sulfate aerosols rose and spread until Earth wore a veil. Sunlight filtered through it weakly at first, then less and less, until midday looked like a bruised twilight. Photosynthesis stopped. That sentence sounds simple, almost too clean for what it means. But photosynthesis is the quiet engine behind forests, fields, and food chains. It is how light becomes sugar, how air becomes leaf, how the sun becomes muscle and bone. When it stalled, the base of the world went hungry. Plants withered, leaves yellowed and dropped. New growth failed, flowers never opened. In places already burned by the firestorm, there wasn't much left to lose. In places that had escaped the flames, the loss came anyway, slowly, insistently, as light refused to arrive. Herbivores suffered first. Think of the great plant eaters, hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, the heavy-bodied grazers built for abundance. Their bodies were designed for constant feeding, for turning enormous volumes of vegetation into energy. They could survive a day without good forage, maybe a few days if water was nearby and temperatures stayed gentle. But this was not a bad week. This was a world where the pantry had been emptied and the doors had been nailed shut. They wandered. They stripped bark from trees. They dug for roots. They tried to chew whatever still held moisture and fiber. They traveled farther, searching for anything green. But the darkness was global. There was no untouched valley waiting over the next ridge. No refuge where sunlight still fell cleanly. Predators followed the collapse like a shadow. At first, meat was everywhere. Carcasses from the blast, from the fires, from the first wave of starvation. Scavengers fed well, and so did the hunters. But meat doesn't stay fresh, not in a poisoned world. And when bodies thinned, predators faced a trap. Hunting costs energy. Chasing costs energy. Fighting costs energy. In a world that no longer pays you back, every effort becomes debt. It's easy from a distance to imagine dinosaurs as invincible. But in this landscape, they were simply large animals with large needs. And that is a fragile thing to be. In the ash, insects moved like punctuation across a ruined page. Some insect lineages vanished quickly, those tied to flowering plants, those that depended on living green. But others thrived, especially the ones that eat decay, that breed in dead wood, that specialize in breakdown. In that time, decomposition became one of the only reliable industries left on Earth. Fungi spread through charred trunks. Beetles bored into softened bark. Flies laid eggs where bodies fell. Tiny organisms unseen did the work of returning death to the soil. It sounds grim, but it mattered. It kept nutrients moving. It kept the planet from locking into total sterility. And beneath the surface, under ash, under root mats, under the broken skin of the ground, mammals waited. Small mammals, often no bigger than a hand. Creatures that had lived in the corners of the dinosaur world, the underbrush world, the nighttime world. They had fur to keep warmth in. They had quick breeding cycles. They could eat a little of many things: seeds, insects, roots, carrion. They could hide from heat and cold in burrows. When the surface became unlivable, being small became a shelter you could carry. It's tempting to believe the end came quickly, like a curtain falling. But extinction is often more like winter, slow, draining, relentless. For weeks, months, and in some places years, Earth lived in dimness. Fires burned themselves into embers, then ash. Smoke thickened the sky further. Acid rain fell, stinging skin, stripping leaves, turning streams sour. And the oceans did not escape. When the sky dimmed, the surface waters dimmed too. Phytoplankton, microscopic plants floating near the surface, could not photosynthesize without light. They died in staggering numbers. And when plankton dies, the sea goes quiet from the bottom up. Zooplankton that fed on phytoplankton starved. Fish that fed on zooplankton declined. Larger fish, marine reptiles, ammonites, whole ladders of life broke rung by rung. The sea is vast. It feels eternal. But its food web can be fragile. When you remove the sunlight, you remove the foundation. Standing on that planet, if you could, would have been a sensory experience you'd never forget. The light, dim, as if the world was stuck beneath a ceiling of storm clouds that never moved. The air, gritty, thick, harsh to breathe, carrying the smell of burning stone and wet ash. The taste of rain, wrong, sharp, metallic, sometimes acidic enough to burn leaves and sting eyes. And the sound, less and less day by day. Fewer calls, fewer wing beats, fewer footsteps. The kind of silence that feels heavy, not peaceful, but vacant. If you survived, it would have felt like being stranded inside a world that had ended while you remained. Scientists call this the aftermath of the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event. But even that name feels too tidy for what it was. More than 70% of species vanished. Entire branches of life erased. Not just individual animals, but whole lineages that had persisted for tens of millions of years. Gone. The dinosaurs, except for the narrow line that would become birds, disappeared. Pterosaurs vanished from the skies. Ammonites vanished from the seas. Great marine reptiles faded out. The world's cast changed almost completely. And in that clearing, after the giants fell, the stage opened. Not immediately. Not like someone turning on a light. The opening was slow, but it was real. Because when the giants vanish, the pressure they exert on everything around them vanishes too. The ground no longer shakes with herds. Trees no longer lose entire crowns to browsing. Predators no longer control territories the size of counties. Nesting grounds open. Burrows become safer. Food sources that were once fiercely contested become available. Space appears. Space is opportunity. That is why this story matters, even now. Not because we enjoy imagining catastrophe, but because catastrophe created the conditions for the world we know. It forced Earth into a reset. Cruel, yes, but also creative, in the way evolution can be creative when given empty rooms to fill. From the ashes of forests, new kinds of plants spread. From burrows, mammals diversified. From seas stripped of old rulers, new forms would rise. The Earth after the impact was not only a graveyard, it was a workshop. Silent at first, then whispering. So let's keep walking, slowly. Because Earth didn't rush. Recovery takes time on a planet this large. Millions of years to rebuild forests, millions to stabilize climate, millions to repopulate oceans with complexity again. But the first steps, the earliest echoes of renewal, began while the sky was still dim. It begins with a strange truth. The impact did not make the planet uniformly dead. It made it uneven. Some places were annihilated, some places burned, some places froze. But in pockets, wetlands, deep water, caves, burrows, sheltered valleys, life endured. Crocodiles endured in rivers and estuaries, shielded by water, slowed by cold-blooded metabolism, able to go long stretches without food. Turtles endured, their shells and slow lives fitting this era of scarcity. Amphibians endured where water remained and temperatures didn't drop too far. Birds, those small feathered survivors, endured. Especially the ones that could eat seeds and Whatever insects remained. Feathers helped, mobility helped, a small body helps. And seeds endured. It's easy to forget plants in stories like this because plants don't run, don't scream, don't stampede. But seeds are one of life's most astonishing strategies. Tiny packages of future, sealed against time. Buried under ash, they waited through darkness. And when light returned, they would be the first to answer. But before that, the planet had to pass through its hardest quiet, the impact winter. With dust and soot high in the atmosphere, temperatures dropped. Not like a single cold night, but like a thermostat being turned down on the whole world. Average global temperatures may have fallen by more than 10 degrees Celsius. In some places, far more. Regions that had been humid and warm turned chill. Cold snapped into ecosystems that had never needed to defend against it. Frost formed on ash. Ice spread at the poles. Tropical belts shrank. Seasons became unfamiliar. And for animals that depended on warmth, this was a second catastrophe layered on top of the first. Reptiles slowed. Amphibians struggled. Even mammals, better insulated, faced the brutal arithmetic of food scarcity and cold weather. Warm bodies burn fuel faster. Fur helps you keep heat, but it doesn't create calories. So mammals did what mammals do when the world becomes hostile. They hid. They conserved energy. They ate whatever they could. Some likely entered torpor, states like hibernation, lowering metabolism to stretch survival across long gaps. Others cached food, seeds stored in hidden chambers, roots gnawed and half-eaten, saved for later. The kind of small, practical planning that becomes a lifeline in a damaged world. And all the while, above them, the sky stayed wrong. Not forever, but long enough to end an age. Because the final death of the dinosaurs wasn't a single day. It was a long narrowing of possibility. Each month with fewer plants, each season with colder temperatures, each year with fewer hatchlings surviving, fewer adults with strength to migrate, fewer prey animals for the hunters. Until the world, step by step, no longer had room for giants. The planet did not rest after the impact. If anything, it became restless, like a body in shock, shivering, trying to stabilize, unable to find stillness. The rock that tore into the Yucatan didn't just leave a crater. It set the world on fire, not metaphorically, literally. Even as molten stone cooled around the wound, the rest of Earth burned. Forests that had stretched unbroken for thousands of miles became sheets of flame. What had once been green and shaded and breathing turned black and orange, crackling and collapsing, sending sparks into an already darkened sky. The rain of molten debris that had circled the globe came back down in waves, each fragment igniting the air as it fell. There was no single wildfire to outrun. There was no safe direction. The air itself was hot enough to dry leaves into tinder. Heat radiated down from re-entering debris and raised surface temperatures so quickly that landscapes ignited almost at once. Grasslands, forests, even damp swamps flared where they could. Smoke thickened, oxygen changed. Water along the edges of lakes and rivers steamed as if the world had been placed over a burner. Imagine what it must have been like for a survivor. Some creature far from the crater, spared the immediate blast, only to face the sky turning into a furnace. Picture a hadrosaur at the edge of a woodland. It feels the ground tremble. It hears a deep sound, too low to be thunder, too steady to be wind. Then the sky brightens, not with sunrise, but with a sick, unnatural glow. Minutes later, sparks begin to fall. The treetops catch, flames race, instinct says, run. But the horizon in every direction tastes like smoke. There's nowhere to run when the planet is burning. We know this isn't just imagination. Ancient charcoal and soot preserved in sediments around the world suggest widespread fires on a scale difficult to grasp. It may be that nearly every forest on Earth burned, not because lightning struck in a few places, but because the atmosphere itself, heated by returning debris, became a trigger. As the fires raged, ash fell like black snow. It coated rivers and lakes. It drifted into wetlands, It clogged gills. It settled into the fur and feathers of survivors, turning every breath into grit. Rain, when it came, didn't clean the world. It made it heavier. It mixed with soot and fell as dark sludge, staining everything it touched, turning lowlands into sticky gray traps. And when the fires finally began to starve, when the fuel was gone and the air had thickened, Earth looked unrecognizable. Charcoal where forests had been, rivers clogged with debris, grasslands stripped bare, entire regions silent. No insect chorus, no bird calls, no heavy footfalls through undergrowth that no longer existed. Even the soil was changed. In places it had been scorched to sterility, its living communities of microbes disrupted, its surface sealed under ash. It would take time, rain, weather, patience, for it to become hospitable again. The global firestorm was not just a side effect of the asteroid, it was the first chapter of the longer extinction. By stripping vegetation, it accelerated starvation. By filling the sky with smoke, it deepened darkness. By turning the world into ash, it prepared the planet for the long winter to come. Think of the scale in terms your body can understand. Today, one wildfire can devastate a region, lasting weeks, turning the sun red, choking cities hundreds of miles away. Multiply that by thousands, stretch it across continents, and you begin to approach what Earth endured then. No horizon without a glow, no air free of smoke. The biosphere became a furnace, and still, life persisted in corners. Crocodiles sank deeper into rivers, turtles buried into mud, amphibians found wet refuges where flames couldn't reach. Mammals gnawed roots and cracked seeds, teeth working like small tools against scarcity. Some birds, descended from feathered dinosaurs, made it by feeding on seeds and insects, the last reliable currencies left in the world. Each survivor carried a thread of continuity. Not loud, not heroic, just stubborn. When the smoke finally thinned, when ash began to settle and the fires died into memory, Earth entered a silence deeper than the one before. But the planet didn't become gentle, because the impact had done something else, something that traveled farther than flame. It made the Earth shake. When the asteroid struck, the crust buckled. A temporary cavity opened and collapsed. The ground rebounded upward in a strange, violent motion, forming a central uplift and then slumping into a ringed structure. That movement released seismic energy on a scale beyond anything in human history. If you've ever felt a small earthquake, you know how it unsettles the mind, the way it turns the ground into something unreliable. Now imagine that sensation magnified beyond comprehension. Not seconds, hours. Waves of shaking radiating outward through continents and oceans. Around the Gulf of Mexico, the ground would have convulsed violently. Cliffs collapsed into the sea. Forests already scorched were torn loose by trembling roots. Rivers sloshed in their channels, flooding plains, then draining back in sudden surges. Animals that had survived fire stumbled as the world betrayed their balance again. Those near the epicenter never had a chance. Crushed by falling rock, swallowed by collapsing slopes, drowned by sudden floods, and the shaking didn't stop at the crater. Seismic waves raced through the planet's crust, circling the globe. Within minutes, tremors reached lands thousands of miles away. Coastlines rattled, mountains shuddered. On the far side of the world, the trembling arrived like a distant echo of pain, a reminder that the Earth is one body, and a blow to one part is felt everywhere. In the oceans, the consequences were even more dramatic. The sudden displacement of water triggered tsunamis, waves taller than skyscrapers, hundreds of meters high, racing outward faster than any animal could comprehend. Hours later, coastlines half a world away were swallowed. Imagine being a creature on a shoreline, far from the crater, not knowing what had happened. Perhaps pterosaurs once perched on cliffs there, scanning for fish. But by the time the wave arrived, those skies were already emptying. Still, the ocean rose, a wall of water blotting out the horizon, smashing against rock, carrying everything away. Reefs were ripped apart, estuaries were scoured clean, beaches were rearranged like loose sand in a fist. Whole coastal ecosystems vanished in minutes. Geologists today find the evidence of these waves far inland. Sediment deposits thrown out of place, shells and marine debris carried to heights they should never reach. The ocean left fingerprints, and the earth kept them. As seismic energy continued to move, aftershocks rolled on for weeks. Fault lines slipped, lands shifted. In some places, volcanic systems may have been disturbed. Chambers jostled, pressure changed. Steam vents and geysers could have erupted in landscapes already choking on ash. For creatures that had sought shelter underground, the quakes were another gamble. Burrows collapsed, trapping mammals that had survived the heat. Cliffs crumbled, destroying nests. Riverbanks fell inward. Survival was no longer about speed or strength. It was about luck. Being in the right pocket of stability when the ground decided to move. And yet, amid shaking and waves and poisoned rain, pockets held. Some valleys absorbed the tremors better than others. Some burrows stayed intact. Some wetlands remained wet enough to resist both fire and collapse. Some sheltered coastlines avoided the worst scouring. Life, again, was uneven. But the shaking wasn't only physical. It was chemical too. Earthquakes and tsunamis stirred sediments from the seafloor. They churned up buried organic matter. They moved toxins into water columns. They pushed ash and soot into rivers and lakes, turning freshwater ecosystems into hostile pools. For animals dependent on clean water, this was another blow. Streams clogged, lakes turned sour, wetlands drowned under debris, then froze under the coming cold. And after each quake, after each roar of collapsing rock, there would have been a stillness so sharp it feels almost audible when you imagine it. A charred forest, smoke drifting, ash settling, then trembling, groaning trees, cracking ground. Then sudden quiet again, as if the planet were holding its breath before the next aftershock. That cycle, tension, rupture, silence, must have defined the first days and weeks after the impact for any creature still alive to feel it. The fossil record bears witness to this turmoil. Jumbled sediments, underwater landslide deposits, chaotic layering, fossil fish buried in silt, caught when waves swept them inland and then retreated, marine shells stranded far above their former homes. These are not deposits of gradual change. They are the handwriting of catastrophe. For humans living millions of years later, it's almost impossible to grasp the scale. The strongest recorded earthquakes in modern times reach around magnitude 9.5. The Chicxulub impact likely released seismic energy equivalent to magnitude 11 or 12, something beyond our lived experience. Buildings wouldn't just crumble, landscapes would rearrange themselves, and though no human eyes saw it then, the scars remain. The shock waves helped shape the crater itself. Temporary cavity, rebound, collapse, peak ring, a complex structure frozen beneath the Yucatan. Today, its buried rings can still be detected, a geometry of trauma preserved in stone. As days passed and shaking gradually lessened, the earth began to settle. Just a little, but the damage was done. Coastlines redrawn, rivers rerouted, ecosystems erased. Above it all, the skies still dark, thick with dust and soot. The fires had burned, the world had shaken, and the dust, patient, quiet, relentless, was only beginning to show its true power. Because what came next wasn't another loud disaster. It was a long, suffocating dimness, a night that would last not hours, not days, but years. The shaking finally eased, though aftershocks still rolled through the crust like a fading heartbeat. The oceans continued to slosh with unnatural tides. The fires that had swept across forests and plains burned down into embers, leaving blackened land where green had been. And in that strange pause, after flame, after quake, the planet began to breathe in something new, something heavier, something that would shape the catastrophe more than the impact itself. It was the ash. Not just the ash you imagine from a campfire, but a global haze, soot from burned forests, dust from pulverized rock, sulfate aerosols from vaporized minerals, and tiny glass beads, spherules, formed when molten rock sprayed into the sky and cooled on the way down. If the firestorm was a scream, this was the suffocating whisper that followed. Soft, relentless, everywhere. When the asteroid struck, it hurled billions of tons of debris upward. Much of it fell back quickly, re-entering the atmosphere as glowing fragments that helped ignite the planet. But a fraction stayed aloft, high in the stratosphere, where winds could spread it around the world. This is what turned a regional blast into a global winter. At first, the change in light might have seemed subtle to any creature still alive. The day dimmed, shadows softened, sunsets stretched and blurred. Then the dimness deepened. Daylight became dusk. Dusk became something close to night. Across the planet, from pole to equator, the sun was veiled. Breathing changed, too. Ash fell slowly, settling on water, on leaves, on the backs of animals that had survived the fire. Each inhale carried grit. Fine particles scratched throats and lungs. Insects clogged their spiracles. Fish found their gills working in water clouded with soot and sediment. And rain, when it arrived, did not bring relief. Sulfur released from vaporized gypsum and other minerals mixed with atmospheric moisture and fell as acid. It burned leaves that still clung to branches. It stung skin. It altered soil chemistry. It turned streams sharp and hostile, and in some basins it made lakes sour enough to kill what little life remained. For survivors, the darkness was more dangerous than flames had ever been. Fire is immediate. It announces itself. You can run from it if you're lucky. Ash is patient. It drifts into every crack. It seals burrow entrances. It coats food. It settles into nests. It doesn't roar or rumble. It simply accumulates until the world feels muted, muffled, exhausted. In rocks around the world, there is still a thin band from this time. Clay, enriched with iridium, a metal rare in Earth's crust, but common in asteroids. That layer is the fingerprint of the impact, the signature left behind by something not born on this planet. But to the creatures living through it, there was no concept of signatures. There was only the practical terror of an engine shutting off. Without sunlight, photosynthesis collapsed. Plants died, not all at once, but steadily. Leaves failing, stems weakening, growth stopping. Without plants, herbivores starved. Without herbivores, predators followed. The chain unraveled. Insects that fed on decay thrived for a time, and for a while they became one of the few functioning links between death and continued life. But even they began to falter as the supply of fresh organic matter dwindled and the cold tightened. The oceans dimmed as well. Phytoplankton, those microscopic plants at the ocean's surface, could not survive without light. As they died, the marine food web cracked from the bottom. Zooplankton declined, fish populations crashed. Creatures that had ruled the seas for millions of years found themselves in barren water. If you try to picture standing on Earth then, don't picture a dramatic apocalypse like a movie. Picture a dull world, a forest that isn't green but gray and black, trunks stripped bare, the ground soft with ash instead of grass, the sky above not blue but a heavy gray without a clear sun, the air smelling of sulfur, sharp, choking, with a constant dry taste of burnt stone. Distances look wrong because haze steals the horizon. And in the silence there are no birds calling, no insect chorus, no rustle of leaves, only the soft fall of ash like snow that never melts. Cooling began quickly. With sunlight blocked, stored warmth drained away. Days grew colder. Nights colder still. Regions that had been warm turned chill, and those already cold became unlivable. Frost formed on ash. Ice spread at higher latitudes. Tropical zones shrank. Animals built for warmth struggled. Cold-blooded reptiles slowed and stiffened. Amphibians froze in shallow pools. Even mammals, better insulated, faced the brutal arithmetic of energy. To stay warm, you burn fuel, but fuel was scarce. This was the impact winter, and it lasted years. But it wasn't only temperature and light that changed. Atmospheric chemistry shifted. Sulfur aerosols reflected sunlight, deepening chill. Ozone was damaged, leaving survivors exposed to harsher ultraviolet radiation once light began returning. Carbon dioxide released by global fires and disturbed geology lingered, waiting in the background like a delayed consequence. For the moment, cooling dominated. The planet wore a dim, cold mask. And still, life clung on. Deep in the ocean, near hydrothermal vents, communities survived untouched by sunlight. Tube worms and bacteria living on chemical energy continued their odd existence, indifferent to the sky's crisis. Underground, seeds waited, dry, sealed, patient. In burrows, mammals rationed energy and ate what they could: roots, stored seeds, insects, carrion. Some likely entered torpor, lowering metabolism to stretch survival across long gaps. Crocodiles sank deeper into rivers, bodies slowed almost to stillness. And above ground, a few lineages of small, hardy birds survived, especially those that could eat seeds. They carried forward the legacy of their dinosaur ancestors, not by strength, but by flexibility. The ash did not last forever. Slowly, particles fell out of the stratosphere. They settled into oceans, forming layers that would one day tell geologists this story. Dust drifted into soils, changing chemistry, making some places more acidic. Rain washed some of it into low valleys and swamps, where it accumulated like sedimentary memory. But for years, enough remained in the atmosphere to keep skies dim and ecosystems stressed. Even after light began to return, scars remained. Forests did not bounce back overnight. Recovery began with pioneers, ferns, and fast-growing plants that could colonize disturbed ground. Their spores were tiny and abundant, their life cycle quick. They spread across ash fields like green paint. In fact, scientists see a fern spike in fossil records after the impact, an explosion of fern spores above the boundary layer, signaling that ferns were among the first to reclaim devastated landscapes. Then grasses and shrubs. Then much later, trees. Insects followed the first green, feeding and pollinating. Mammals ventured farther from their burrows, sniffing the air, testing the world with cautious hunger. Birds spread along recovering edges, pecking seeds, hunting what insects returned. But the old world did not come back. The great dinosaurs, massive bodies built for abundance, could not survive years of darkness and cold. They required too much food, too much steady energy. Even if some lingered after the first blast, even if some endured the firestorm, the long winter narrowed possibilities until nothing remained for giants. They dwindled, then disappeared, leaving only their smaller bird relatives to carry dinosaur blood into the future. It is strange to think that our story, human story, was written in the fallout of ash. Without those years of gray skies, mammals might have remained small, hidden. Without the collapse of dinosaur dominance, primates might never have had the space to evolve. Without this reset, the world might have stayed a reptile-ruled planet for far longer than we can imagine. Every step you take today on soil carries particles older than any human language. The rocks beneath you hold quiet traces of that time. Thin layers, altered chemistry, microscopic beads of glass. And if you close your eyes, you can almost picture it. A dim world, endless twilight, ash falling softly, muffling sound, earth wrapped in a blanket not of comfort but of silence. A silence so heavy that even millions of years later it leaves a mark in the stones, in the fossils, in the shapes of the living world. The fires faded, the quakes eased, the waves calmed, and then came the longest night. Not ordinary night. A sustained darkness that lingered month after month until generations of small creatures lived and died without ever seeing a true sunrise. Imagine waking each day to the same dim ceiling. The sun, if it showed itself at all. a pale disk behind haze, daylight like dusk, dusk like the edge of black. For plants, it was death. For the creatures that depended on them, it was hunger. For ecosystems, it was collapse. Yet even in that extended night, life did not surrender entirely. It shrank, it hid, it waited, and waiting, quiet, stubborn waiting would become the bridge between worlds. The darkness did not lift quickly. Even as ash began its slow fall and the sulfur haze thinned in places, the heat that once wrapped the planet had already bled away. The fires had consumed oxygen. The soot had blocked most sunlight, and the atmosphere wore a film of particles that scattered what little light tried to enter. What began as a sky problem became a ground problem, then a water problem, then a problem written into blood and bone. It wasn't just dim anymore. It was cold. This cold did not arrive like a clean seasonal shift. It crept. A week that felt merely brisk became a month of frost. A month of frost became a season that never found spring. In places that had not seen ice in millions of years, thin films formed on still water. Ponds sealed, marshes stiffened, rivers slowed at the edges and locked in quiet reaches. Cold-blooded animals fell silent early. Not because they were weak, but because their biology is honest. Without external warmth, metabolism slows. Movements become rare, then stop. Reptiles that once basked on warm banks became statues in gray daylight. Amphibians, sensitive to both chemistry and temperature, vanished in many regions when shallow waters froze or turned acidic. Plants, already starved for light, faced a second failure. Some species had hidden resilience, roots storing energy, seeds sealed against time. But many above-ground tissues could not withstand freezing after prolonged stress. Cells that had been weakened by hunger were now vulnerable to ice crystals. Leaves blackened, needles browned. In burned landscapes where ash lay like a thin insulation, soil beneath could still chill deep and fast. Seeds told a different story. For a seed, waiting is not an emergency. It is a strategy. Dry, protected, buried, it can outlast seasons it cannot see. The cold did not kill every seed. In some cases, it helped preserve them by slowing decay. In the oceans, surface cooling came swiftly. With sunlight blocked, the top layers lost heat to the air without replenishment. Winds stirred those layers, mixing cold downward. The upper ocean became denser and sank in places, driving deep water up, water that was colder still and often poor in oxygen. This rearranged currents. It rearranged chemistry. Dead organisms from the first crash, plankton, fish, everything that couldn't endure the darkness, settled into deeper water and decomposed, using oxygen as they did. Zones of low oxygen spread like bruises. Fish already stressed by starvation found their gills pulling water that held less and less of what they needed. Near coasts, scoured by tsunamis, water was filled with sediments and debris, dark as tea, sharp with acids washed down from ash. Some inlets became cold, still traps where mixing slowed and oxygen failed. On land, the chill rewrote behavior. Mammals that had used darkness as cover now lived in a permanent night with frost layered on top. They compressed their lives into cautious bursts, short ventures from shelter, quick returns. Their bodies conserved heat by curling tight, sharing warmth in clusters. Small size helped. Fur helped. But the greatest advantage was flexibility. A mammal could gnaw roots, crack seeds, eat insects, chew carrion. A specialist, an animal built for one perfect food source, was trapped. Birds found a different set of trade-offs. Mobility helped them search wider ranges, but flight is expensive. Feathers insulated them beautifully, yet warm-blooded bodies demand fuel, and fuel was scarce. The lineages that did best were often seed eaters, strong beaks, guts capable of pulling calories from dry stores. Those that depended on fish or flowering plants struggled when oceans collapsed and blooms vanished. Some birds likely followed coastlines and river edges, scavenging what remained. Others relied on cached seeds, the last savings of a green world. The cold touched the atmosphere too, in subtle ways that mattered. Sulfur aerosols reflected sunlight and encouraged the formation of brighter clouds that kept more energy from reaching the surface. With fires mostly out, new soot production slowed, but the finest particles already aloft could persist for years. Ozone damage lingered, waiting to matter when sunlight returned, and ultraviolet cut harder through a thinner shield. During the deepest part of the winter, the main reality was simple. The daily flow of energy into the system had been throttled, and when energy is throttled, everything slows. Storm patterns shifted. Some regions saw fewer rains because cooler air held less moisture. Other regions saw snow in places that had not known it in tens of millions of years. Snow cover, bright and reflective, bounced even more sunlight back into space, reinforcing chill. Hillsides stripped of vegetation after fires and waves became unstable. When soil froze and thawed, it heaved and slumped. Burrows collapsed. New ones were dug. Life became an engineering problem solved with claws and persistence. There were refugees, small islands of bearable conditions. Geothermal areas offered warmth and liquid water. Caves held steadier temperatures than the surface. South-facing slopes caught what little light remained and stayed slightly warmer. Along some coasts, complex tidal mixing and milder waters prevented the worst freezing. These refugees could not support the abundance of the old world, but they gathered survivors into pockets where lineages endured. The fossil record keeps track of this, not with dramatic scenes, but with stress written into growth. Bones of survivors show interrupted development, rings and lines that suggest famine and slow growth. Shells record colder water in their chemistry. Lake sediments show abrupt die-offs when oxygen vanished, then slow returns when conditions improved. The Earth kept receipts. As the years wore on, the causes of cooling began to change shape. Fires had released vast carbon dioxide. Volcanic outgassing in the years after may have added more. Under normal skies, that would warm the planet. But as long as reflective aerosols remained high, greenhouse warming was muted. When the particles finally began to clear decisively, the climate did not snap back smoothly. It wobbled. Some regions stayed cold longer because snow cover persisted. Oceans, having reorganized their circulation, did not immediately return to earlier patterns. Currents took new paths, and those paths controlled where nutrients rose, where water stayed oxygenated, where life could rebuild first. For land animals that had endured the worst, the easing of cold brought both opportunity and risk. Warmer spells encouraged movement and breeding, but late freezes could still kill exposed young and wipe out fragile new plant growth. The earliest recovering landscapes were patchwork, one slope greening while the neighboring hollow stayed barren and gray. Animals tracked these green edges like a shoreline. Flexibility beat specialization again and again. Many mammals likely reproduced quickly, emphasizing more offspring rather than investing heavily in a few. Short generations are powerful in unstable times. A line that can try again soon has more chances to catch the brief windows when conditions align. Plants, too, returned in the forms best suited to disturbance. Grasses, already present in the late Cretaceous, were well positioned to spread across scoured soils. Their growth points sat low, protected from grazing and cold snaps. Ferns, classic pioneers after catastrophe, painted swaths of ground green when moisture and temperature allowed. Shrubs followed where roots could take hold. Trees returned slowly, first hardy pioneers that tolerated harsh light and wind, then the beginnings of canopies that would eventually stabilize microclimates again. Until then, openness favored animals that preferred edges and mosaics rather than deep forest. The cold left legacies in bodies and behaviors long after the worst months passed. Dense fur and mammalian descendants tells a story of ancestors for whom warmth was survival, not comfort. The ability to enter torpor, or deeper hibernation, offered extra lives when temperatures dropped and food disappeared. Hoarding became profitable. Burrow architecture improved, chambers deeper, entrances angled to block wind, networks complex enough to escape floods and predators. Social clustering mattered. Shared heat saves calories. Even many modern bird behaviors, communal roosts, synchronized foraging, huddling, make deep sense when traced back to ancestors that met long cold nights with little food in their crops. Rivers taught lessons too. Ice formed along banks, creating under-ice channels where water still moved. Fish sheltered there if oxygen allowed. Mammals learned those margins were dangerous but rewarding. Thin ice could break, but weakened fish could be reached through cracks. When occasional warm pulses arrived, ice shoved and broke, pushing sediment into new bars, flooding back channels, cutting new routes. Animals that tracked these changes found food earlier than those that waited for stability that didn't yet exist. In the seas, recovery began in bursts. Where light returned enough to reach surface waters, plankton blooms appeared. Sudden explosions of life that sometimes crashed as quickly as they rose. Cold water species spread where warmth had retreated. Warm water survivors were bottled into shrinking belts near the equator. Food webs favored opportunists, those that could eat a mix of resources, including detritus drifting down from above. Scavenging became central, knitting ecosystems together when primary production was intermittent. Cold by itself is blunt. What made this episode decisive was stacking. Light loss starved the base. Fire stripped cover. Waves scoured coasts. Quakes shattered ground. Then cold drained momentum from every living process that depended on steady input. The sequence mattered. If cold had come first under bright skies, many plants and animals could have braced. If darkness had come without cold, some might have scraped by on stored heat and delayed growth. Together they narrowed choices until only the most adaptable, the best sheltered, and the luckiest moved forward. It's tempting to tell this as small survived, large died. But size wasn't the only filter. A small creature with a narrow diet could be as doomed as a large grazer. A large crocodile with slow metabolism and access to water that didn't freeze solid could be better positioned than a tiny specialist dependent on nectar from flowers that no longer bloomed. Cold blurred categories. It rewarded traits that lowered the daily cost of being alive and multiplied ways to find calories when the landscape offered only meager options. As the cold years stretched on, the memory of the warm green Cretaceous faded from the surface. Charred stumps remained, trunks toppled into sediments, ash dunes locked under thin snow. But daily life was now set by a new climate. Air stung when inhaled too deeply. Water drank by mouth stole heat instantly. Sound traveled differently over frozen ground, sharper on clear nights, muffled when snow fell again. Predators used those acoustics. Prey learned to listen through the hush. And then, slowly, the cold loosened its grip. Not with a clean ending, but with a change in feel. Ice thinning on lakes, winds losing some bite as plants began roughening open ground again, the air regaining a little softness. The same survivors that had tunneled, clustered, and rationed began to explore farther from shelter. Cold still visited. Scarcity still returned. But the planet was edging toward a different phase, because above all this, the sky, patient as it had been, was finally starting to clear in a way that would matter. And when the first true warm seasons returned, they would meet a biosphere made cautious and clever by deprivation. A world no longer ruled by giants. A world ready, quietly, for the next chapter. For more than 150 million years, dinosaurs had been the ruling presence on land. Not a side feature of ecosystems, but their backbone. The largest bodies moving across the continents. The shapes that determined what grew, what hid, what ran, what waited. Their footsteps were thunder, their shadows long, their presence inescapable. From long-necked titans that reached into treetops, to horned herds that moved like weather across plains. From predators with jaws built to crush bone, to feathered hunters no larger than a hawk. They filled roles with the confidence of an age that had never been interrupted. But the rock that fell from the sky rewrote the rules, and in the dim, frozen years that followed, their greatest strength, their size, became a trap. It matters to remember that extinction is rarely a clean, cinematic moment. When we say the dinosaurs died out, it's tempting to picture a world going silent at once. But the truth was slower and harder. The impact was the blow. The darkness was the squeeze. The cold was the lock. The dinosaurs did not vanish in a day. They dwindled across months and years, each season with fewer plants, fewer hatchlings surviving, fewer adults strong enough to travel, fewer prey animals for the hunters. Their bodies were built for abundance. A large herbivore needed staggering amounts of vegetation each day. A large predator needed reliable prey to keep its muscles fed and its temperature steady. In a world that had lost sunlight, there was no steady anything. Picture a hadrosaur herd, not as a museum skeleton line, but as living motion. Once, it would have been a river of bodies flowing through fertile land, their calls echoing, their young tucked within the moving mass. Now imagine that same herd after the impact winter begins to bite. The plain is gray. The river is choked with debris. The trees are black stumps. The animals move slower, ribs visible beneath skin. Their calls are no longer the confident noise of plenty, but ragged sounds, confusion, hunger, stress. The young stumble. Adults pause too long over stripped bark. They dig for roots that are woody and scarce. Predators circle, not sleek, not thriving, but thinning too. They strike not for dominance, but for calories, and every chase costs more than it returns. Step by step, the herd dwindles. Predators fared no better. A tyrannosaur's body was a masterpiece of power. Skull built for force, legs built for speed, senses tuned for hunting. But power is expensive. In a world where prey collapses, that masterpiece becomes debt. A starving tyrannosaur, once the terror of a green world, would have been reduced to scavenging in gray forests, fighting smaller hunters over scraps of carrion, risking injury in every confrontation because healing requires food, and food was the rarest resource on Earth. Some likely turned on their own kind, not for territory, not for mate access, but for meat. Hunger erodes rules. The cold sharpened the decline. Dinosaurs weren't simply cold-blooded, like modern reptiles in the way people often imagine. Many likely had higher metabolisms than typical reptiles. Some carried insulating feathers. Some may have been warm-blooded or near it. But higher metabolism means higher fuel demand. Small birds could stretch survival by eating seeds, by slowing down, by roosting together. Large dinosaurs could not shrink their daily requirements enough. Their metabolisms demanded more than the barren world could pay. Even migration, one of life's oldest strategies, failed them. Because this wasn't a local disaster. This wasn't go south. Darkness and chill were global. There was no untouched refuge beyond the horizon. In the oceans, giant reptiles faced the same spiral. Mosasaurs, apex predators of the seas, had thrived on abundant fish and ammonites. But when plankton died, the latter collapsed upward. Fish starved. Ammonites disappeared. And soon, the mosasaurs followed, size becoming an anchor in empty water. For pterosaurs, the great flying reptiles, the story was similarly unforgiving. They had soared above Cretaceous coasts, some with wingspans wider than small airplanes. They fed on fish, small animals, carrion. But fish populations crashed. Land animals dwindled. Carrion was soon picked clean. Their light, fragile bones were perfect for flight. But hardship is not kind to delicate engineering. The skies emptied. And the collapse of the giants was not only ecological, it was audible. The earth grew quieter. The trumpeting of herds, the heavy percussion of feet, the vast presence of bodies moving through forests, those sounds vanished one by one. Rivers once churned by crossings flowed more smoothly. Forests once vibrated with the passage of enormous animals stood still. Ash settling where leaves used to rustle. The fossil record shows this transition with a brutal clarity. In the last layers of Cretaceous rock, dinosaur bones still appear, though often fewer, sometimes smaller, sometimes from individuals that likely died young. Stress and scarcity written into the population. Then, above the boundary layer, they vanish. What remains instead are the traces of the small: mammal teeth, bird bones, turtle shells, crocodilian fossils, insect impressions. It's not that the world became empty. It's that the center of gravity shifted. Large animals need stability. Vast food webs, reliable climate, consistent plant growth. Small animals can bend with instability. They can live on scraps. They can retreat into burrows. They can reproduce quickly. They can survive in a single valley when the continent becomes hostile. When catastrophe strikes, size becomes vulnerability. And yet, dinosaurs did not vanish entirely. Birds carry their legacy. Every sparrow in a parking lot, every hawk riding a thermal, every pelican skimming the sea, every hummingbird hovering at a flower. These are dinosaurs, not metaphorically, literally. Descendants of feathered theropods that endured because they were small enough, flexible enough, seed-eating enough to slip through the narrow crack extinction left open. The giants died, but their lineage still sings. And for mammals, the quiet survivors, the disappearance of giants was opportunity. Suddenly the world was open. Forest floors no longer shook with heavy feet. Plains no longer belonged to herds the size of houses. The sky no longer held the shadow of pterosaur wings. Nest sites, burrow territories, feeding niches, emptied. The stage was cleared. It didn't become paradise. Recovery was slow, fragile, interrupted by further climate swings and ecological instability. Many mammal lineages that tried to expand would fail. But the rules had changed, and mammals were finally allowed to be more than background. The early Cenozoic did not begin with grandeur. It began with quiet ambition. Mammals that had once lived as nocturnal insect hunters began to diversify. Some leaned harder into seed eating. Some experimented with omnivory. Some became dedicated carnivores, testing hunting strategies once dominated by reptiles. Their bodies changed quickly in evolutionary terms. Teeth, especially teeth, tell the story well because teeth fossilize and teeth reveal diet. After the boundary, the variety of mammal tooth shapes expands. Sharp cusps for slicing insects, flatter surfaces for grinding plants, mixed patterns for omnivory. That explosion of dental variety is the fossil signature of opportunity. Warm-blooded bodies helped mammals navigate lingering cold. Fur insulated them. Milk allowed mothers to nourish young even when outside food was unreliable, turning the mother's body into a moving pantry. Larger brains, relative to body size, enabled flexible behavior. New foraging strategies, new shelter choices, new social patterns. Traits that had been minor advantages under dinosaur domination became decisive when the world reset. Imagine a landscape 10 years after the impact. The sky is still not fully clean, but brighter than before. Forests are patchy, ferns, shrubs, young trees in scattered stands. The ground is uneven, disturbed, with ash still in low places. Across this land, mammals move, some no larger than mice, others edging into the size of small cats. They dig for roots, climb for seeds, chase beetles in leaf litter. Their rustles and tiny calls fill a silence once owned by giants. For the first time, they are not incidental noise. They are the main story. As centuries passed, mammals continued to test size. Some lineages stretched into larger herbivores, browsing on recovering vegetation. Carnivores followed, sharpening adaptations for bigger prey. In time, much later, mammals would return to the sea, beginning a long path toward whales and dolphins. But in these early chapters, the theme was simple: occupy the empty. Yet even as mammals rose, the world still carried scars. Soils were altered by acid rain and ash. Rivers carried sediment-heavy flows. Oceans remained unstable, their food webs rebuilding in fits. The climate, transitioning from reflective aerosol cooling toward greenhouse warming, could swing unpredictably. There were false springs, sudden chills, food booms followed by crashes. In that instability, the winners were not necessarily the strongest, but the most adaptable. The old order was gone. The new order was forming. And above it all, the sky slowly, reluctantly, continued to clear. Because when light returned with real strength, it would do more than brighten landscapes. It would restart the engine. Photosynthesis would surge. Plant communities would expand beyond pioneers. Forests would thicken. Food webs would lengthen. The world would become capable of supporting bigger bodies again. But it would never again be the Cretaceous. The age of dinosaurs had closed. And in the long quiet that followed their passing, life did what life does when the world hands it empty space. It experimented. It diversified. It rose again. Different, smaller at first, then bold. And somewhere in that rising complexity, in the branching maze of mammal lineages, a path would eventually lead, slowly, accidentally, to us. On land, the giants had fallen silent. Forests were reduced to black sticks and ash dust plains. But the oceans, vast and seemingly untouchable, had their own catastrophe to endure. If the surface world was cloaked in soot and cold, the seas responded in ways that were immediate and then quietly lethal. For millions of years before the impact, the Cretaceous ocean had been generous. Plankton blooms fed everything above them. Reefs were alive with complexity. Schools of fish moved like living weather. Ammonites, coiled and ancient, filled the water column. And above them, great marine reptiles hunted with the confidence of a stable world. Then the asteroid struck. The first oceanic effects were violent. A blast wave tore through shallow water. The seafloor near the impact was instant ruin. Water vaporized, life erased in a heartbeat. The crater collapse sent tsunamis outward, waves hundreds of meters high racing across basins, reaching distant shores hours later. Those waves ripped coral reefs from their foundations, tore apart deltas, and dragged forests and soil into the surf. Coastlines were rearranged in a day. But when the waves receded, the ocean's deeper trouble began. Ash and soot that dimmed the skies also fell onto the sea's surface. At first, a thin film, then rain carried more, mixing it down into the upper layers. Light, already weakened, was blocked even further. And for phytoplankton, that was fatal. Phytoplankton are microscopic plants drifting in sunlit surface waters. They are small enough to be invisible individually, but together, they are one of the planet's great engines. They turn sunlight into food. They generate oxygen. They are the first rung on an oceanic ladder that holds fish, sharks, turtles, seabirds, everything. When the sky darkened and the surface waters dimmed, phytoplankton died in massive numbers. The marine food web collapsed from the bottom. Zooplankton that grazed on phytoplankton starved. Small fish that fed on zooplankton declined. Larger fish followed. Ammonites, so successful for so long, disappeared entirely. Marine reptiles that depended on healthy fish populations began to starve, their great bodies turning from apex to liability. The ocean did not roar as it died. It went quiet. And the quiet was chemical. Normally, phytoplankton absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen, helping balance both the ocean and the atmosphere. Without them, carbon dioxide built up. The oceans, always hungry for CO2, absorbed vast amounts of it from the air. But instead of being processed through living cycles, that CO2 dissolved directly into seawater and formed carbonic acid. Slowly, subtly, the ocean became more acidic. And acidification is cruel in a very specific way. It targets the builders. Creatures that make shells or skeletons from calcium carbonate, corals, many plankton, shellfish, ammonites, found their armor weakening, dissolving, becoming porous. A protection honed over millions of years turned unreliable in months. Reefs bleached and crumbled. Shell-bearing plankton collapsed. Entire lineages could not survive the chemistry shift. Meanwhile, dead matter rained down. When plankton, fish, and larger organisms die in large numbers, their bodies sink. Normally, scavengers and decomposers recycle that rain efficiently. but the volume after the impact was overwhelming. Bacteria feasting on the dead consumed oxygen. The result was anoxia, water with little or no oxygen, spreading through parts of the ocean like a dark stain. In such water, animals suffocate even if food exists. Fish can't breathe. Many invertebrates can't endure. Dead zones expanded in coastal areas and in some basins deeper. In the fossil record, scientists find layers from this period that are dark, rich in organic material, laid down when oxygen was scarce and decay slowed. They find fish preserved in sudden burial, gills flared, caught at the edge of a collapse. In some places, bacteria thriving in low oxygen conditions produce toxic byproducts, including hydrogen sulfide. That gas can make waters poisonous, turning shallow seas into traps where life fails even faster. So the ocean's disaster had layers. Darkness that halted photosynthesis, starvation that collapsed food webs, acidification that dissolved shells and reefs, anoxia that removed breathable oxygen, toxic chemistry that made some waters outright hostile. And yet, the ocean was not entirely dead. Survivors endured, often in unexpected forms. Sharks persisted, those ancient opportunists, though their diversity and numbers were cut hard. Some lineages found ways to survive on whatever fish remained, whatever carrion drifted, whatever niches stayed oxygenated. Turtles endured better than many. Their hardy bodies and flexible diets carried them through instability. Some moved between freshwater and marine environments, using rivers and estuaries as lifelines. Crocodilians and brackish systems held on to, benefiting from slow metabolism and the buffering of water against temperature extremes. And in the microscopic realm, certain plankton species, especially those less dependent on bright light or capable of feeding on detritus, slipped through the bottleneck, not thriving, not flourishing, but enduring enough to seed future oceans. Imagine for a moment, hovering above those seas if a human could have watched. The surface would have looked dull under the dim sky, but the smell rising from it might have been wrong. Salt mixed with rot, with sulfur, with the faint chemical bite of a system out of balance. The great aerial shadows of pterosaurs were gone. The seabirds that remained were fewer. The water in places would have carried a strange discoloration, sediment, ash, algae blooms that came and crashed unpredictably. The ocean was quiet, but it was not at peace, and it did not recover quickly. Even when light began to filter back, recovery was uneven. Some regions bloomed briefly with new phytoplankton, especially where currents brought nutrients to the surface. But those blooms were unstable, collapsing as conditions shifted and chemistry remained hostile. The ammonites never returned. Coral reefs, those slow architects, rebuilt only after long delays, and in new forms, in new places, under new rules. The marine reptiles were gone for good, leaving the seas without their old rulers. When scientists study this period now, they see the shock written in chemical traces. They find carbon isotope shifts, evidence that the planet's carbon cycle was disrupted. They find etched shells, proof of acidified waters. They find black shales, signs of anoxic events. And above all, they find the boundary itself, that thin layer enriched in iridium, carrying the fingerprint of the cosmic intruder. The ocean, like the land, had been reset. It was not simply a wounded Cretaceous sea. It was becoming something else. And from that something else, new lineages would rise in the long, patient aftermath. Tiny survivors would diversify. Fish communities would reassemble. Sharks would adapt and spread again. Eventually, mammals would return to the water and begin one of evolution's most astonishing migrations, back into the sea. But that is later. In the first years and centuries, what mattered was endurance. Life persisted not because the ocean was kind, but because some organisms were built for hardship, built for low oxygen, for scavenging, for waiting out bad chemistry. The seas turned strange, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a layered collapse, darkness, acid, suffocation, and then, slowly, a layered recovery. And on that slow turning edge between loss and renewal, the world we know began to assemble itself. Because when the ocean's old rulers vanished, the ecological space they left behind did not remain empty forever. Space is an invitation. Evolution does not leave invitations unanswered. In stories like this, it's easy to focus on the giants, on what fell, on what vanished, on the empty places left behind. But the true bridge across extinction was built by the small, by the overlooked, by the creatures that never ruled anything, never filled horizons, never shook the ground. They survived, not because the world favored them, but because catastrophe narrowed life to whatever could fit through the smallest cracks. Picture the world then. Forests reduced to blackened stumps, plains gray and open, rivers carrying ash, oceans dim and sour, the air still carrying a bite of sulfur after rain. The sun presents somewhere above the haze, but weak, like a memory trying to become real again. And beneath your feet, if you could walk there, burrows, twisting tunnels carved by mammals that had lived in secrecy for millions of years. Small bodies, quick hearts, hungry mouths. Creatures no larger than modern shrews or rats, built for the underworld of roots and insects. They had been small because they had to be. Dinosaurs ruled the open day. Mammals learned to live in shadow, under leaf litter, inside cracks, underground. And when the asteroid struck, that training, unintentional, evolutionary, became salvation. A small body needs less food. A burrow shelters against heat, against cold, against wind-blown ash. A generalist diet gives options when the world changes too fast for specialization to keep up. Where a hadrosaur needed tons of plants each season, a mammal could live on a handful of seeds. Where a tyrannosaur needed reliable herds, a mammal could survive in one valley, one patch of recovering fern and shrub, one wetland edge. The catastrophe was a storm. Storms spare what is hidden deep enough. Seeds were another lifeline, and it's worth pausing to appreciate how quiet and powerful that is. In the impact winter, plants could not grow, but many of their seeds, encased in tough coats, buried in soil, tucked into cones and pods, endured. They were time capsules of energy meant for a future that might never come. Mammals cracked them open with sharp teeth. Birds did too, especially the seed-eating lineages that would become the ancestors of so many modern birds. There were no grain fields then, no agriculture, no tidy rows, but nature's storehouses were scattered everywhere. Seed pods, nuts, cones, caches buried by animals that never returned. Each seed eaten was a day bought, a body carried forward, a lineage extended across darkness. Insects became lifelines as well, often overlooked, rarely celebrated, but essential. Many insect groups suffered, especially those tied tightly to living foliage and flowers. But detritivores, those that feed on decay, found themselves in a grim abundance. Beetles laid eggs in carcasses and rotting wood. Larvae wriggled through the softened remains of a world that had collapsed. Flies multiplied where bodies fell. Worms and mites worked the soil. For mammals, lizards, and birds, these swarms were food, small packets of energy recycled from death. In that era, insects were the gears still turning when so much else had ceased. They broke down the dead and returned nutrients to the soil. They fed the survivors that waited out the worst. They kept ecosystems from stalling completely. Reptiles as a broad group fared unevenly. Many lineages suffered hard under cold and disruption, but some held on with remarkable endurance. Crocodilians are the obvious example. Their bodies are built for patience. They can slow metabolism, survive long stretches without eating, hide in water that buffers temperature swings, and eat almost anything when food appears. Fish, carrion, smaller animals, even each other, if pressed. When the world collapsed, crocodilians didn't need to win. They needed only to outlast. Half buried in mud, eyes and nostrils above the surface, they waited. Turtles did something similar. Their shells protected them. Their slow metabolisms bought time. Their diets were flexible. Many could survive on plant matter, on small invertebrates, on scavenged scraps. They endured in freshwater and coastal systems where conditions allowed. Amphibians, often sensitive, often fragile, survived best in pockets where water remained liquid and not too poisoned. Streams trickling beneath ice, wetlands buffered by groundwater, places where chemistry didn't swing too far. Their small size and rapid reproduction gave them a chance to rebound quickly when conditions improved. And birds, true surviving dinosaurs, were among the most important carriers of continuity. Not all birds made it. Tooth-bearing birds and more specialized forms disappeared. But the lineages that could eat seeds and insects, that could shelter, that could reproduce quickly, persisted. Small bodies, feathers for insulation, mobility to search for scarce food. These traits stacked into survival. From those survivors came every bird alive today. If you listen closely, their songs are echoes, soft, distant, of the fact that a dinosaur lineage made it through the world's hardest narrowing. In the oceans, survival was harsher, but not impossible. With plankton chains collapsing, many creatures vanished. Yet tiny plankton species with unusual metabolisms endured in patches. Some could feed on detritus rather than relying entirely on sunlight. Small fish and crustaceans that could eat a wide range of resources survived in reduced numbers. Sharks persisted, diminished, but present. And again, turtles bridged the gap, hardy travelers through unstable seas. What all these survivors shared was not strength as domination, but strength as adaptability. They were generalists. They could hide. They could wait. They could make do. In a stable, abundant world, specialists thrive. Creatures exquisitely tuned to one resource, one climate, one pattern. In catastrophe, specialists collapse. Generalists inherit what remains. Now imagine walking through that world, not as a triumphant explorer, but as a quiet observer. The land looks dead at first glance. Stumps, ash, gray light. The sea looks empty. The air smells wrong. But then you notice movement. A mammal slips from a burrow, nose twitching, and gnaws a root. A bird hops through ash, pecking at a seed. A crocodilian slides through a stream, barely disturbing the surface. A beetle works a carcass with efficient patience. The earth looks dead, but it is not. It is holding its breath, and the breath is carried by the tiny. The fossil record preserves this truth in fragments. At the boundary layer, the thin global band of debris marking the impact, scientists find microfossils, tiny teeth, fragile bones. Above it, the great bones vanish. But these small traces multiply. They are the bridge. They are the proof that life did not stop, only shifted its center of gravity. And from these survivors, the future opened. Mammals, no longer constrained by giants, began to grow and diversify into niches left vacant. Birds filled skies emptied of pterosaurs. Crocodilians and turtles continued their steady persistence, unchanged in many ways because what worked during disaster worked after it too. Insects flourished as plants returned, rebuilding the intricate relationships between leaves and mouths, flowers and pollinators, decay and soil. It is humbling, quietly staggering, to realize how much our own existence leans on these small survivors. Without them, there would be no mammal line leading toward primates, no primates toward humans, no human eyes to look back and tell the story. Every breath we take is linked to those tiny shrew-like mammals, to those seed-cracking birds, to those crocodilians wading in mud. The giants ruled with spectacle. The overlooked carried continuity. In the end, survival was not about being the strongest. It was about fitting through the narrowest opening fate left available. And when the light finally began to return, slowly, unevenly, hesitantly, these survivors stepped out into a world emptied of giants but full of possibility. They were small, but they were alive, and that was enough. The Earth was not silent only in its animals. The impact, the fires, the darkness, and the cold reached into the green fabric of the planet and pulled hard. Forests burned to skeletons, plains emptied, and the quiet engine of life, photosynthesis, went still. Plants, which had painted Earth with color for hundreds of millions of years, seemed to vanish almost overnight. Stems withered. Leaves turned brittle. Flowers never opened. But plants are not only what we see above ground. Beneath the ash, beneath frozen soil and gray paste, life hid in roots and seeds. What looked like death was often waiting. In the first months after the impact, ash fell thick enough to blanket entire landscapes. Valleys filled, river channels clogged, wetlands were coated in gray. Rain mixed with ash into a heavy slurry that sealed the surface like a skin. For many plants, that was the end. No light, no breathable air in the soil, no energy left to push through what covered them. Whole forests vanished in silence. But other plants had prepared for hardship long before any asteroid appeared. Seeds, tough, compact, resilient, carried the genetic memory of endurance. Some could remain dormant for months, others for years. Waiting is written into their design. They are capsules of future life, packed with stored energy and instructions, built to survive uncertainty. In the Cretaceous, plants had already perfected this strategy. Conifers dropped cones filled with seeds meant to endure cold seasons and hungry mouths. Flowering plants scattered pods and nuts, some armored against fire, some small enough to vanish into soil and be forgotten until conditions softened. Roots told their own story of patience. Many plants store energy below ground in bulbs, tubers, and thickened root systems. Even if the stems and leaves above were destroyed, these hidden structures could remain alive, dormant, insulated, ready to send up new shoots when light and warmth returned. So in those earliest months, the Earth looked barren. But beneath the surface, it held an underground memory. And then, slowly, the sky began to change. Not suddenly, not cleanly, but enough. As dust thinned in patches and faint sunlight returned, the first green appeared, not as forests rising overnight, but as pioneer life, plants that specialize in disturbed ground. Ferns were among the first. Ferns don't rely on seeds. They reproduce by spores, tiny, light, incredibly resilient. Spores can ride wind, they can settle into cracks, they can wait through hard times. When the world offered even a narrow window of moisture and light, ferns answered fast. They unfurled across ash fields, painting gray landscapes with delicate green. In the fossil record, scientists see this as a fern spike, a sudden explosion of fern spores above the boundary layer. It's one of the clearest botanical signatures of a planet recovering from catastrophe. It's also a quiet kind of beauty. The idea that the first widespread green after a world-ending event was not a towering tree, but a frond. After ferns came other quick colonizers. Grasses and small flowering plants pushed through disturbed soils. Shrubs followed. In some places, low thickets formed, dense tangles that stabilized soil and trapped moisture. In others, open patches remained for longer, as if the land itself was still undecided about becoming a forest again. Trees returned slowly. Trees are not built for haste. They need time, stable seasons, and soils that can support long roots. Many tree lineages that had flourished before the impact never returned. Others, once minor players, expanded into the newly open space. Recovery was not a rewind, it was reshaping. Imagine walking across an early recovering landscape. The ground is gray and broken, but here and there, green catches your eye. Ferns unfurling, bright against ash. Small shrubs pushing upward with stubborn shoots. Thin clusters of grass waving where wind once lifted only dust. The air still carries sulfur and dampness, but there's a hint of soil now. A faint, living smell returning. Birds flit between patches, pecking seeds, hunting insects. Mammals scurry at the edges, nibbling shoots and roots. Insects crawl over the first fragile flowers, working their ancient jobs again. Slowly, a rhythm begins. The return of plants was not passive. It was strategy paying off. Some plant species had always lived in cycles of fire and flood, evolving the ability to bounce back after disturbance. In the post-impact world, these species had advantage. Ferns with quick life cycles spread first. Grasses with low growth points, protected from grazing and cold, expanded in open spaces. Shrubs and hardy trees anchored disturbed soils. Over time, larger trees followed, shading the ground, creating microclimates, offering new habitats. As plants returned, animals followed, not because animals knew the world was healing, but because each green shoot was food, shelter, and signal. Plants do not merely decorate landscapes, they create them. Roots hold soil in place, slowing erosion. Leaves shape the water cycle, drawing moisture up and releasing it as vapor. Plant bodies fuel herbivores, and herbivores fuel predators. When plants reappeared, even in patchy forms, they began knitting the world together again. And the atmosphere responded. As forests and thickets expanded, they drew carbon dioxide from the air and exhaled oxygen. That process does not happen instantly at planetary scale, but over thousands and millions of years it matters. It helps stabilize climate. It rebuilds the balance animals depend on. Vegetation also roughened the land, slowing winds, reducing dust storms, trapping moisture. In places where the ground had been bare and harsh, plant cover softened conditions. The planet began to feel less like a wound and more like a place you could live on again. But the first forests were fragile. Fires could sweep through easily, fueled by dry wood and grass. Insect outbreaks could devastate young stands. Floods could drown seedlings. Droughts could wither them. Many attempts failed, yet enough succeeded. Within a few million years, fast in geological time, green stretched across continents again. Not the same green, not the same forests, but forests nonetheless. And those forests became laboratories. Flowering plants, already diverse before the extinction, expanded rapidly in the Paleocene. Their flowers attracted insects. Their fruits fed birds and mammals. Their quick reproduction allowed adaptation to changing conditions. Fruits and seeds became tools of partnership. Plants that offered rewards, sweet pulp, nutritious seeds, encouraged animals to carry their offspring farther than wind alone could. Birds and mammals became seed dispersers. Insects became pollinators. A web of relationships tightened and spread across the recovering world. In the shade of these young forests, mammals found opportunity. Some began climbing more, feeding on fruit and insects in branches. Early primate-like mammals appeared, small, grasping, alert-eyed, taking advantage of three-dimensional habitats that dinosaurs had once dominated in other ways. Birds nested in new canopies. Reptiles used shaded pools. Amphibians benefited from moisture held in restored soils and leaf litter. The rise of plants did not simply follow recovery. It drove it. Without seeds that waited, without roots that stored energy, without spores that spread fast, the land might have remained barren far longer. Ecosystems would have stalled. Animal recovery would have lagged. Instead, the green returned and pulled the rest of life with it. Even today, you can see echoes of that strategy. After modern wildfires, ferns often return first. After volcanic eruptions, grasses and shrubs colonize ash fields. Seed banks and soil can wait decades for a chance to sprout. The same quiet resilience that carried plants through the asteroid catastrophe still operates now, in your world, outside your window. The story of the asteroid is often told as the end of dinosaurs. But it is also the story of seeds, silent, patient, underground, refusing to let the world stay gray forever. It is the story of ferns, those humble pioneers, turning ash into green. It is the story of forests rising again, not as replicas of what was lost, but as foundations for what would come next. Because from those forests, mammals would diversify further. Birds would expand. insects would build relationships that still shape the living world. The planet's workshop phase, the long quiet after catastrophe, began to fill with sound again. Leaves rustling, insects buzzing, wings beating, small feet moving in undergrowth. Not the thunder of dinosaurs, something softer, but very alive. The giants were gone. The forests were returning in new shapes. Rivers ran again, carrying fewer ashes each season. The sky, still imperfect, was learning how to be blue. And in the spaces that opened, life didn't simply recover, it reinvented. What followed was not a quiet rewind back to the Cretaceous. It was a new chapter written on a landscape scraped down to its foundations. Evolution, which is always shaping, suddenly found itself with empty rooms, vacant roles, unoccupied niches, open territory. It's difficult to imagine that kind of ecological freedom. For more than 150 million years, dinosaurs had been the weight that bent ecosystems around them. Mammals had stayed small because large-bodied niches were filled. Birds had stayed constrained in certain ways because pterosaurs owned portions of the sky. Plants had grown under the trampling feet and constant browsing of dinosaur herds. Even insect communities moved in patterns influenced by the giants that shaped their plant worlds. Then the asteroid removed that weight. Entire roles stood empty. Grazer, browser, apex predator, large-bodied scavenger, canopy shaper, seed disperser on a massive scale. The silence begged to be filled. Mammals were among the first to answer, cautiously at first, then with accelerating diversity as conditions stabilized. In the Paleocene, within a few million years of the impact, mammalian lineages began branching at a pace that looks explosive in the fossil record. Small insect eaters diversified into forms that tested new diets and new behaviors. Some grew longer snouts and sharper teeth, leaning into predation. Others broadened their molars, leaning into plants. Still others mixed strategies, becoming omnivores that could survive when any single resource failed. Body size expanded too, not to the scale of later Cenozoic giants yet, but beyond what had been safe under dinosaur dominance. Mammals moved from shrew-sized shadows into fox-like and dog-like ranges. They began to climb more, dig more, swim more. They experimented with lifestyles dinosaurs had dominated, but now without dinosaur competition. And in those returning forests, a particular experiment began to take shape, one that would eventually matter to you, and to me, and to everyone who has ever looked at the sky and wondered how we arrived here. Early primates, not the primates you picture, no monkeys with expressive faces, no great apes, but small, tree-dwelling mammals with grasping hands and feet, forward-facing eyes, and the beginnings of a life spent navigating branches. Forests, especially young, patchy forests, create a world of edges and opportunities. Fruit and insects in the canopy, safe pathways above ground, nest sites among leaves. For small mammals, climbing can be survival. In that arboreal world, selection favors grip, vision, coordination. It favors brains that can manage distance and depth. It favors curiosity. Those early primate-like mammals were fragile, yes, but they were experimenting in a world suddenly willing to let mammals experiment. On the ground, another major storyline began: the rise of hoofed mammals. At first they were small, no bigger than cats or foxes, simple-bodied generalists that could nibble plants and browse leaves. But the recovering world offered open spaces and new vegetation patterns. Flowering plants diversified. Grasses began to spread in disturbed soils. Shrubs and young trees created mosaics, patchwork habitats perfect for animals that could move efficiently and feed flexibly. In time, these early hoofed mammals would branch into the ancestors of horses, deer, camels, cattle, and countless others. The path from cautious browsing to sweeping herds began here, in this early era of opportunity. And where herbivores expand, predators follow. Carnivorous mammals began evolving sharper specializations, stronger jaws, slicing teeth, faster bodies. Some lineages leaned toward ambush, others toward pursuit, others toward scavenging with opportunistic hunting. They were still small compared to the apex predators that would come later, but they were claiming roles once held by tyrannosaurs and raptors. For the first time, mammals occupied the top of food chains as hunters shaping prey behavior. Birds, too, took advantage of open space. With pterosaurs gone, the skies belonged to birds without contest. Seed-eating lineages spread into new habitats. Waterfowl diversified along rivers and coasts. Predatory birds refined talons and hooked beaks to claim aerial hunting roles. Some birds grew large and flightless, striding across open ground as new, strange giants, reminders that when a role is vacant, nature will try filling it again, even if the new occupant looks nothing like the old. Plants were not passive participants in this reinvention, they drove much of it. Flowering plants expanded rapidly in the Paleocene and beyond, experimenting with fruits, seeds, flowers, and growth strategies. With many dinosaur herbivores gone, the pressures on plant communities changed. New partnerships formed between plants and mammals and birds. Fruits became rewards. Seeds became trade. Plants that could attract animals to disperse their offspring gained reach. Animals that could exploit fruit and seeds gained reliable calories. This mutual shaping, plants influencing animal evolution, animals shaping plant success, accelerated the rebuilding of complex ecosystems. Insects responded as well, and in many ways they stitched the web together. As flowering plants spread, pollinators diversified. Bees, butterflies, beetles, flies, each group evolving alongside blooms, each shaping the other's future. Other insects adapted to mammals and birds as parasites, scavengers, or mutualists. The intricate network of relationships that defines modern land ecosystems tightened during this era. The oceans, too, were rewriting themselves. With marine reptiles gone and ammonites vanished, the sea was quieter. But it was not empty. Fish communities reorganized, sharks diversified again into new forms, turtles expanded into niches left vacant, and in a longer arc, still ahead, mammals would begin their own return to water, setting the stage for whales and dolphins. But even before that, the ocean was becoming a new world under new rules, seeded by the survivors that endured the dark. What makes this moment so remarkable is not just the appearance of new forms, but the speed. In stable ecosystems, evolution can feel slow, hemmed in by competition and entrenched roles. After catastrophe, when niches are empty and competition is reduced, change can accelerate. Traits that were minor advantages become decisive. Lineages that were once marginal can spread quickly. Opportunity is fuel. And in the early Cenozoic, opportunity was everywhere. It's tempting to read this as progress, as if life were climbing toward mammals, toward primates, toward humans. But evolution doesn't aim, it responds. Each lineage that expanded did so because it could, because the conditions allowed it, not because it was meant to. For every branch that led toward something enduring, countless branches ended. Experiments failed. Lineages vanished. Ecosystems shifted again and again. The Paleocene was not a straight road. It was a maze, a branching chaos of trials and temporary successes. And yet, among those branches, the ones that lasted define the world we know. Imagine watching that world unfold in real time. In the recovering forest canopy, small primate-like mammals leap between branches, hands closing around twigs, eyes forward and alert. On the ground, early hoofed animals browse leaves, their legs becoming a little more efficient with each generation. Along rivers, turtles bask while crocodilians slide through shallows. Above, birds call, some flitting, some soaring, some running across open ground. Insects hum in flowers, leaves rustle. The world is not the Cretaceous. It is not our world either. It is a world in between, alive with possibility. The bones of dinosaurs still lie in soil in places, settling into sediments. The oceans still bear chemical scars from acidification and anoxia. Charcoal still marks layers where fire once ruled. But life does not live by nostalgia. It lives by need. Each generation cared only about the next meal, the next shelter, the next successful offspring. And in that relentless focus, new forms emerged, each one an answer to the question, how do you live in a world remade? From those answers, the arc of life bent toward the present. Mammals grew into grazers and predators. Birds filled every corner of the sky. Flowering plants spread across continents. Insects built relationships that still shape ecosystems. Oceans stabilized into new patterns. The asteroid ended one story, but it made room for countless others. And one of those stories, slow, accidental, improbable, eventually included us. Beneath your feet, wherever you are listening from, there's a library that does not use ink. It uses bone and clay, charcoal and crystal, pollen grains smaller than dust, layers of sediment laid down like slow snowfall over millions of years. The Earth keeps its memories that way, quietly, patiently, without commentary. And the story we've been walking through tonight, the falling star, the fire, the darkness, the long cold, the reshaping of life, left one of the clearest signatures in that library that geology has ever seen. A thin line, sometimes only a few centimeters thick, sometimes a little more, but found around the world. From North America to Europe to Asia to the deep ocean floor. A narrow boundary separating two worlds. Below it, a planet still full of dinosaurs, ammonites, pterosaurs, old forests, familiar seas. Above it, a planet missing them. That line is not metaphor. It's physical. In many places, it's enriched with iridium, a metal rare in Earth's crust, but common in asteroids. When scientists first noticed that iridium spike, it was like finding a foreign accent in the planet's own handwriting. Something from beyond had entered the record. Mixed into that boundary layer are tiny, glassy spheres. Impact spherules, formed when rock was melted by the collision and sprayed into the atmosphere as droplets, then cooled while falling back down. Each bead is a frozen moment. Earth turned liquid in midair. And then there is shocked quartz. Quartz is ordinary, common, quiet. But quartz that has been struck by pressures far beyond volcanic forces carries microscopic scars, fine lines etched through its structure, patterns that form only in impacts. Under a microscope, those lines become undeniable. This was not a slow change. This was a blow. The fossils tell us who was lost and who endured, but minerals and clay tell us how the loss began. They are the planet's receipts. Charcoal fragments and sediments tell us the world burned. Soot signatures match the chemistry of forests turned to smoke. Marine cores show chaotic deposits consistent with tsunamis and seafloor slides. Dark layers record times when oxygen vanished and decay slowed. Anoxic episodes in the sea. Shells show signs of acidification, etching and pitting that speak of seawater turned chemically hostile. Even growth lines in surviving animals, stress marks in bone and shell carry the story forward. Not in words, but in pattern. Years of scarcity, interrupted growth, life struggling to keep momentum. When paleontologists kneel in dirt and brush away soil from a tooth or a fragile bone, they are not just uncovering an object. They're uncovering a voice from silence. And the silence is as important as the sound. Above that boundary layer, whole groups stop appearing. Dinosaurs, except the bird lineage, are gone. Ammonites vanish. Pterosaurs leave no more wing bones. Entire long-running experiments in life simply end. The absence is the message. It's humbling to realize how much of that world we will never know. Most organisms do not fossilize. Soft-bodied creatures vanish without trace. Whole lineages of insects, fungi, microbes, gone, their stories erased by the simple fact that bodies decay. The fossil record is incomplete. And yet, in this case, it's clear enough to change how humanity understands its own history. Because this is not just a story about dinosaurs, it's a story about contingency. About how one cosmic intersection forced life into a new shape, and about how that shape eventually included us. The crater itself, the Chicxulub impact site, remains hidden beneath the Yucatan, buried under younger limestone. You can't stand on its rim and see it the way you can see a canyon or a volcano. But the Earth remembers it in subtler ways. Gravity anomalies, seismic reflections, and even the arc of sea notes, sinkholes that trace the crater's ring like a necklace of groundwater windows. Drill cores pulled from that buried scar contain their own testimony. Melted rock, fractured crystals, layers of debris that record the first moments after impact, and the slow settling after. Even in the place of greatest destruction, life returned surprisingly quickly, microbes colonizing the waters above the crater, ecosystems rebuilding from the smallest scales upward. The scar healed enough for life to stand on it again, but it never vanished. And that's the theme we keep meeting in this story. The Earth breaks, the Earth remembers, the Earth rebuilds. If you're listening at night, maybe the room around you is dim, maybe your breathing has slowed, maybe your mind has drifted into that soft space where facts feel like waves instead of sharp edges. So let's gently pull the camera back, far back. Imagine Earth from space, years after the impact. The glow of fires is gone. The thickest dust has begun to fall. Light returns in thin sheets, oceans regain some color. Green patches reappear on land in fern carpets and young shrubs. The world is quieter than before, but not empty. The planet looks bruised, but alive. And in that aliveness lies the strangest truth of all. Catastrophe can be both an ending and a door. Not a door anyone would choose. Not a door anyone alive at the time could understand. But a door, nonetheless. Because the end of the dinosaurs was not just loss, it was also vacancy. And vacancy is where evolution works fastest, where experimentation spreads, where lineages once confined to shadows can step forward. Mammals did not rise because they were better. They rose because they were small enough to endure the bottleneck: fur, burrows, flexible diets, fast generations, milk, adaptable behavior. Birds endured as the living thread of dinosaur lineage. Plants endured through seeds and spores and underground reserves. Insects endured by feeding on decay and then on new green. Oceans endured through microbes and hardy generalists and the slow rebuilding of cycles. The world that came after did not look like the one before, but it worked. It functioned. It became complex again, and eventually, much later, it became familiar enough to hold primates, then humans, then cities, then telescopes aimed back at the sky. Which brings us to a quiet and unsettling reflection. The same cosmos that ended one age has not stopped sending stones through the dark. We do have awareness now. We track near-Earth objects. We model trajectories. We test deflection strategies. That doesn't make us invulnerable, but it means we are not blind in the way the Cretaceous world was blind. And perhaps that awareness, our ability to read the planet's library and learn from it, is its own form of resilience. Because the Earth's history is not only a museum of bones, it is a manual, a reminder that stability is precious, that systems can collapse when their base is cut away, and that recovery, while possible, is not guaranteed to preserve what we love. So, as we approach the end of our walk tonight, let's hold two truths side by side. Life is fragile. Life is resilient. The asteroid proved both. We've walked together through an ending that didn't arrive like a curtain drop, but like a long dimming, a flash of impact, a rain of fire, a planet shaking, forests turning to charcoal, oceans turning strange. Then the slow, suffocating quiet, ash in the air, acid in the rain, cold seeping into soil and bone, and then, almost stubbornly, the return. Not the return of what was lost, but the return of life itself, in smaller voices at first. Ferns, seeds, burrows, insects, birds, mammals, the low hum of a world restarting. If you step back far enough, the story looks simple. An asteroid struck. Dinosaurs died, mammals rose. But the closer you stand to it, the more patiently you listen, the more you realize it's not simple at all. It's layered. It's slow. It's full of contingencies, false starts, and uneven survival. It's a story of systems. Because the asteroid didn't need to hunt dinosaurs. It only needed to disrupt sunlight and chemistry and climate long enough to break the web that sustained giants. Once photosynthesis stalled, once food chains collapsed, the old order could not hold. And that is the part of the story that reaches forward into our present. Not as a warning meant to scare you awake, but as a truth meant to ground you. We live on a planet held together by invisible networks. Sunlight into leaf, leaf into insect, insect into bird, plankton into fish, soil into crop, water into forest. We build our civilizations on top of those networks and sometimes forget they are there until they strain. Chicxulub reminds us that Earth can change quickly when a foundation is shaken, but it also reminds us of something that feels almost tender in its persistence. Life does not give up easily. It bends, it retreats, it hides, it waits. It becomes smaller if it must. It learns new diets, new shelters, new rhythms. It rebuilds from the margins. The survivors of that catastrophe weren't the strongest or the most fearsome. They were the adaptable. They were the generalists. They were the ones who could tolerate uncertainty, who could live on little, who could slip into cracks and endure a long season without promises. And from them, an entire age was born. The forests that returned were not Cretaceous forests. They were new mosaics shaped by pioneer plants and altered soils, by the absence of dinosaur browsing, by the partnerships of flowering plants with insects and mammals and birds. The oceans that stabilized were not the old ammonite-filled seas. They were new seas with new food webs, new rulers, new chemistry rhythms. And the land slowly became a stage for mammals. At first, small, then larger, then diverse in ways the dinosaur world had never allowed them to be. Tree dwellers and runners, diggers and swimmers, grazers and hunters. The world grew into a shape where primates could appear, then later apes, then much later humans. We are, in a quiet sense, descendants of that night, children of a bottleneck, heirs to survivors that made it through darkness not by conquering but by enduring. And when you hold that in your mind for long enough, it can change how you feel about your own place in the story. Not as the goal of evolution, because evolution has no goals, but as a consequence of Earth's willingness to keep going. A consequence of resilience that isn't loud, just persistent. The fossil record, thin boundary clays, iridium spikes, shocked quartz, fern spores, tiny mammal teeth, doesn't tell this story with flourish. It tells it with absences and quiet accumulations. But when you learn to read it, you realize Earth wrote down the moment the world changed and then kept writing the slow recovery line by line. And perhaps that is one of the most comforting truths buried in such a terrifying chapter. The planet remembers, but it also moves forward. The crater remains under the Yucatan, hidden beneath limestone and time, its outline traced subtly by rings of sinkholes in the instruments of scientists. A scar you can't see with your eyes unless you know how to look, and yet it shaped everything. If the asteroid had missed, if its orbit had been nudged differently by some distant gravitational whisper, dinosaurs might have continued ruling. Mammals might have stayed small, nocturnal, marginal. Primates might never have found their canopy. Humans might never have existed. Our presence here is not inevitable. It is contingent. That realization can feel unsettling, but it can also feel like a kind of awe, because it means this quiet moment, your breath, your thoughts, the simple fact that you're listening, sits atop a mountain of deep time, a chain of survival stretching through fire and ash and cold. And if you're listening at night, maybe that thought can soften something in you. Not because the world is safe, Earth's history tells us it isn't always safe, but because the world is capable of renewal, even after unimaginable loss. Now, before we close, let me return to the question I asked near the beginning, because I like the feeling of a story coming full circle. Where are you listening from right now? If it's late, maybe the room feels quieter than it did when you first pressed play. Maybe the edges of your thoughts have blurred. Maybe you've drifted away from your day and into something slower. If it's morning, maybe you're carrying this story with you into light, into a day that feels a little wider, a little older, connected to something vast. Either way, the sky outside your window is the same kind of sky that once carried debris from Chicxulub, the same sky that once dimmed for years, the same sky that cleared again. When you look up, you're looking at continuity, and if you find this kind of slow journey through science and story soothing, if it helps you rest or think or simply feel less alone in the quiet, I'd be grateful if you liked the episode or subscribed. It helps Echoes of the Forgotten Earth reach others who might need a gentle place to land. Because here, we don't just talk about Earth's beauty. We talk about its scars. We talk about what it loses and what it rebuilds. We talk about how deep time holds both fragility and resilience in the same hand. And now, we can let the story settle. We can let the ash fall. We can let the long night end. We can let the first green rise again, fern by fern, leaf by leaf, until the world becomes loud enough to host birdsong and footsteps, and eventually, us. Until next time, wherever you are, breathe slowly, look at the sky when you can, and remember, it has carried life through darkness before, and it can carry life into dawn again.